The wind in Dust Valley, Wyoming, had a personality. It was a mean, thirsty thing, born in the barren flats to the west and arriving in town with a temper. It scoured the paint from the false fronts of the buildings, rattled the glass in the windows of the Golden Spur Saloon, and carried a fine red grit that got into a man's teeth and the folds of a woman's soul. The dust was the color of old blood and tasted of endings. People here did not so much live as they endured, their face etched with the same hard lines as the landscape. It was a place held together by raw timber, stubbornness, and a loose interpretation of the law, which mostly meant whatever Sheriff Barton McGraw said it was on any given day. From her second-floor room above the saloon's clamor, Eliza Hart could feel the wind pressing against the building, a constant, wearying shove. For 8 years, that wind had been the soundtrack to her life. Now, it was a farewell. On the cornhusk mattress lay a single, worn leather valise, its clasps tarnished and its sides scuffed from a journey it had yet to make. It had been her father's. Inside, her few possessions were folded with a precision that bordered on reverence: 2 simple calico dresses, a change of underthings, a thick wool shawl for the mountains, and a small, cloth-bound book of poetry he had given her. Each item was a deliberate severing of a tie to this place. Each fold was a prayer for a new beginning in Denver, a place she imagined with clean air and cobblestone streets, a place where a woman could be a nurse, a healer, instead of a server of whiskey to men whose hands were too quick and whose eyes held too much of the wilderness. She paused, her hand hovering over a small, carved wooden bird, the last thing her father had made for her. Its wings were smooth beneath her thumb. He had been a kind man, a carpenter whose gentleness was as out of place in Dust Valley as a spring lily. He saw the good in people, even when there was none to be found. Sheriff McGraw had seen only a threat, a man who spoke too openly about fairness and the railroad cheating folks out of their land. A false accusation, a hasty trial, and a rope had been McGraw's answer. The memory was a physical ache in Eliza's chest, a raw spot that 8 years of Dust Valley wind had failed to scour away. Placing the bird carefully between the folds of her shawl, she closed the valise. She would not cry. Tears were a currency this town did not honor. A sudden commotion from the street below broke through her thoughts. It was not the usual drunken shouting from the Golden Spur. This was sharper, uglier. Eliza moved to the window, pushing aside the thin, grime-coated curtain. The sun was a merciless white eye in the sky, bleaching the color from the dusty street. 3 men, all wearing the tarnished star of McGraw's deputies, had a young boy cornered against the wall of the general store. The boy, barely 10 years old, clutched a bruised apple to his chest. He was one of the O'Malley children. His father lost in a mine collapse the previous spring, his mother taking in laundry to feed a brood of 6. "Thieving little rat," one of the deputies, a beefy man named Haskins, snarled. He backhanded the boy. Not hard, but with a casual cruelty that made Eliza's stomach clench. The apple rolled into the dust. The boy didn't cry out. He just stood there, his small body trembling, his eyes wide with a terror that was far too old for his face. "Gonna learn you a lesson about touching what ain't yours," another deputy chimed in, stepping forward and raising his hand. Eliza's own hand flew to her mouth. She felt a helpless rage surge through her. The same hot, useless anger she had felt the day they took her father. This was how it worked in Dust Valley. The strong preyed on the weak, and the law was the strongest predator of all. She looked around the street. Folk stopped to watch, their faces blank and distant. No one would intervene. No one ever did. Then, a man stepped out of the blacksmith's forge across the street. He moved without hurry, his tall frame cutting a stark silhouette against the forge's fiery glow. Cole Remington, owner of the vast Rocking R Ranch, a man who had ridden into Wyoming 5 years ago with nothing and now owned half the valley. He was a puzzle to the townsfolk. He kept to himself, spoke few words, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. Some said he had been a gunslinger, that his fortune was built on a violent past. Others whispered he was just a hard worker who got lucky. He was dressed in plain, durable clothes, no fancy gun belt or silver conchos, but he carried an authority that no tin star could grant. Remington didn't walk toward the deputies. He walked to the apple lying in the dust. He bent down, picked it up, and brushed it clean against his trousers with slow, deliberate movements. The deputies paused, watching him with wary contempt. "That your business?" Remington Haskins demanded, his voice thick with false bravado. Cole Remington finished cleaning the apple. He looked at the boy, who was still pressed against the wall, frozen with fear. Then his gaze lifted to the deputies. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet sound of it carried across the street with unnerving clarity. "The boy looks hungry. I imagine his mother would appreciate him bringing something home." "He stole it," the third deputy spat. "He's a thief." Remington's eyes settled on him. "Did he?" He took a step toward them, still holding the apple. "Or did Mr. Henderson at the store give it to him? I saw them talking not 5 minutes ago. Henderson gives the O'Malley children his bruised fruit. Has for months." He tossed the apple gently to the boy. "Go on home, son." The boy snatched the apple from the air and scurried away, disappearing into an alley without a backward glance. Haskins's face purpled with rage. He had been made a fool of, his authority challenged in the middle of the street. "You got no right interfering with the law." "Remington." "Was that the law?" Cole asked, his voice still level, almost conversational. Looked more like 3 grown men about to cause harm to a child. The tension in the street became a palpable thing, heavy and hot as the afternoon sun. Haskins put his hand on the butt of his pistol. It was a foolish, predictable move. Remington didn't so much as blink. He simply stood there, his hands loose at his sides, his gaze unwavering. He was not a man who made threats. He was the threat itself, calm and absolute. A long, silent moment passed. The wind swirled dust around their boots. Haskins seemed to shrink, the bluster draining out of him under that relentless, quiet stare. He knew, and everyone watching knew, that this was a fight he could not win. He dropped his hand, muttering a curse under his breath. "This ain't over." "It is for today," Remington said. He turned his back on them, a gesture of supreme dismissal, and walked toward the saloon. The deputies, robbed of their purpose and their pride, stomped away in the opposite direction, their anger a sour cloud around them. From her window, Eliza Hart let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the windowsill. She had watched the whole exchange, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had seen men stand up to McGraw's deputies before. It usually ended with fists or bullets, a loud and bloody affair, but she had never seen anything like this. Cole Remington hadn't used force. He had used the truth. He had used a quiet, unshakable certainty that was more powerful than any gun. And in that moment, as he stood alone in the street, protecting a child for no other reason than it was the right thing to do, she did not see the cold, wealthy rancher the town whispered about. She saw her father. She saw the same innate decency, the same quiet strength, the same refusal to let bullies have their way. Her father had possessed a gentle version of that strength, one that had been no match for McGraw's corruption. Remington's was harder, forged in a fire she could only guess at. But it came from the same place, a place of justice. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow, shaking the foundations of her resolve. For 8 years, she had believed that kindness and decency were weaknesses in a place like Dust Valley, fatal flaws that got good men killed. Her plan to leave was built on that belief. Flee, escape, do not engage. But Cole Remington had just shown her another way. He had not fled. He had stood his ground, not with violence, but with conviction. He had made a choice. She looked at her packed valise on the bed, the symbol of her own choice. Suddenly, it felt less like a vessel of hope and more like an act of cowardice. The wind rattled the window pane, calling her away to Denver, to safety. to a life where she would not have to witness such casual cruelty. But for the first time in a long time, another voice, one that sounded very much like her father's, whispered in her mind. It asked a simple, terrible question. If all the good people leave, who will be left to fight the monsters? Eliza backed away from the window, her gaze locked on the worn leather of the suitcase. The dust of Dust Valley was still in the air, but something had shifted. A crack had appeared in the hard shell she had built around her heart. A wealthy, solitary rancher had defended a hungry child over a stolen apple, and in doing so, had reminded her of a truth she had tried desperately to forget, that even in the harshest wilderness, a single act of courage could plant a seed, and she did not know if she was strong enough to leave before she saw whether it would grow. The image of Cole Remington standing in the street lingered in Eliza's mind, stubborn as a ghost. It had disturbed the fragile peace she had spent years building. She turned from the window, forcing her attention back to the valise on the bed. Denver. The word was a talisman. In Denver, she would trade the smell of stale whiskey and dust for the clean, sharp scent of carbolic acid and starched linens. She would be a nurse, not a saloon girl who patched up the brawlers the town doctor was too drunk or too indifferent to see. Dr. Miller was a good man once, but the harshness of this place had worn him down to a nub, leaving him with only a bottle for comfort. She would be a professional, respected for her skill, not her face. A life of purpose, a life where her hands brought comfort instead of just slinging drinks for rough men. She ran a hand over the rough leather of the suitcase. Her father had wanted more for her. He had spoken of sending her back east to a proper school, of a life far from the raw edges of the frontier. His dreams had died with him, but hers had taken root in their place, tenacious and vital. She would not let the memory of one decent act by a solitary rancher unravel them. This town had taken everything from her. She would not allow it to take her future as well. She owed it to her father, and to herself, to leave Dust Valley in her past, a bad memory smoothed over by time and distance. She would get on the morning stagecoach, and she would not look back. The decision, remade with fierce resolve, settled her nerves. She began her nightly routine of tidying the small room, a habit that imposed order on the chaos of her life. She was wiping down the small wash basin when a firm knock sounded at her door. It was not the clumsy fumbling of a drunken patron or the timid rap of one of the other girls. It was a solid, measured sound, cautiously. She opened the door a few inches. Cole Remington stood in the hallway. He held his hat in his hands, and up close, he seemed even taller than he had in the street. The light from the hall lantern cast shadows across his face, highlighting a rugged handsomeness she had never taken the time to notice before. His stormy gray eyes met hers directly, and they held a gravity that made her feel strangely exposed. "Miss Hart," he said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of the usual pleasantries. "I apologize for the late hour. I need your help." She kept her hand on the door. "My help, I think you have the wrong person. Mr. Remington, I serve drinks. That is all." A flicker of something, perhaps impatience, crossed his face. "I am told you have a skill for mending men, better than Dr. Miller, on his best day." He did not wait for her to agree or deny. "One of my ranch hands, a young man named Silas, was caught under a spooked horse. His leg is in a bad way. I cannot get him back to the ranch tonight, and I will not leave him to the doctor's care." Eliza's first instinct was to refuse. This was exactly the kind of entanglement she was trying to escape. Tending to the town's broken bodies was a trap, a way for Dust Valley to keep its hooks in her. But the image of the injured man, Silas, rose in her mind. A young man, far from home, hurt and in pain. Her father had taught her that you do not turn your back on suffering. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice clipped. "I have him in a room downstairs." Cole answered, "I paid for it for the night. I will pay you for your time." "Of course." The offer of money stung. "I do not want your money. Mr. Remington—" She stepped back, opening the door wider. Let me get my things. She gathered a small basket containing clean linen strips, a bottle of whiskey for cleaning the wound, a jar of her own herbal salve, and a needle and thread. When she turned back, Cole was watching her, his gaze resting on the packed valise on her bed. He said nothing, but a question hung in the air between them. She ignored it, brushing past him into the hallway. The injured man was laid out on a narrow bed in a room that smelled of damp wood and loneliness. He was young, no older than 20, with a face pale from pain and shock. His trouser leg had been cut away, revealing a mangled, bloody gash on his calf, deep and torn. Eliza set her basket down and went to work without a word. She was in her element here. The sight of injury did not disturb her. It focused her. She cleaned the wound with a practiced, gentle efficiency, her movements deft and sure. Silas flinched and gasped, but she spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, the way she had seen her mother soothe frightened animals. Cole stood near the door, a silent observer. He had expected a saloon girl playing at nurse. He found instead a woman of quiet competence and compassion. He watched her hands, steady and capable as they stitched the torn flesh with neat, even sutures. He saw the concentration in her face, the way her brow furrowed slightly, her entire being focused on the task of healing. There was no fuss, no wasted motion. She worked with the focused grace of a master craftsman. When she was finished, she had bandaged the leg tightly. She gave the young man a small amount of laudanum from a bottle she carried, just enough to dull the pain and allow him to sleep. "He will need to stay off it for at least a week," she said, her voice professional and distant as she cleaned her tools. "The wound must be kept clean, or it will fester." "I will see to it," Cole said, his voice softer than before. He moved away from the wall, stepping closer to the small table where she worked. "You have a gift, Miss Hart." "It is just common sense," she replied, not looking at him. She was acutely aware of his presence in the small room, of his size and the quiet energy that emanated from him. "No," he said, "it is more than that. I have seen many men tend to wounds. They are butchers or they are cowards. You are neither." He paused. "My father was a doctor. I know the look of a true healer when I see it." His words were unexpected, and they chipped another piece from her carefully constructed wall. She finally looked up at him. His expression was sincere, his gaze direct and searching. "Why do you stay here, Miss Hart? A woman with your talent does not belong in a place like this." The question was the one she had been asking herself for years. But hearing it from him, from the man who had just shown her that decency could exist here, it felt different. It felt like an accusation. "This place is what I know," she said, her voice tight. "And soon it will be what I knew. It makes no difference to me." She put the last of her things in her basket and stood up, ready to leave. The air between them was thick with unspoken thoughts. "I saw what you did today," she said, breaking the silence. "For the O'Malley boy. That was a foolish risk to take." He gave a slight shrug. "Some risks are necessary. I do not like to see the strong torment the weak. Sheriff McGraw and his men have had the run of this valley for too long." "Standing up to them gets people killed," she said, and the bitterness in her voice was sharp as broken glass. "Good people." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a deep, weary understanding. "I know about your father," he said quietly. "He was a good man. This town did him a great wrong." The mention of her father was a blow. She flinched as if he had struck her. "You do not know anything about my father." "I know he believed in justice," Cole said, his voice unwavering. "I know he was not a man who would run from a fight if he believed it was right." The implication was clear, and it ignited her anger. All the fear and frustration and grief of the last 8 years boiled over. Who was this man to judge her, to speak of her father, to question her choices? He knew nothing of her life, of the daily struggle to survive in a town that had branded her the daughter of a criminal. "I am not my father," she said, her voice as cold and hard as she could make it. She walked to the door, needing to put space between them. needing to escape the intensity of his gaze. She stopped, her hand on the latch, and turned to face him one last time. "I am leaving town." She said the words like a final verdict, a door slamming shut. She expected him to nod, to accept it, to let her go. Instead, a look of profound, undisguised regret settled over his features. The hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by a sorrow that seemed to reach out and touch her. He looked from her face to the empty space in the hallway where she would soon be, and then back again. "Then I guess I am the fool who showed up too late," he said. The words were spoken softly, a simple statement of fact, but they hit her with the force of a physical impact. They were not a plea, not a protest, just a quiet admission of a loss he had not realized he was facing until that very moment. He was not trying to stop her. He was mourning a possibility that had vanished before it ever had the chance to exist. He took a step back, giving her room, and inclined his head slightly. "Thank you for your help. Miss Hart, I am in your debt." Then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the hall, leaving her alone in the quiet room with the sleeping, injured man. She stood frozen by the door, his last words echoing in the silence. A fool who showed up too late. The cold certainty she had clung to all evening had shattered, leaving behind a painful, confusing ache. She had made her choice. She was leaving. It was the right choice, the only choice. So why did it suddenly feel like the greatest mistake of her life? Cole's words followed Eliza into a restless sleep and were there to greet her when she awoke before dawn. "Then I guess I am the fool who showed up too late." They were not the words of a man trying to manipulate her, but the quiet, plain-spoken truth of a man who had seen something he wanted, only to realize it was already gone. The stagecoach to Cheyenne, the first leg of her journey to Denver, was due to leave with the rising sun. She dressed in the gray light, her movement slow, her mind a tangle of confusion. The valise sat by the door, a silent accusation. She stood at her window and watched the coachman hitch the team. A few passengers milled about, their forms indistinct in the morning mist. This was it. This was the moment she had worked for, saved for, longed for. Freedom was a 4-horse team and a dusty trail away. Yet, her feet felt rooted to the floorboards. She thought of her father's quiet strength and Cole Remington's hard-won decency. She thought of the O'Malley boy clutching his apple. What kind of person ran from the first flicker of hope she had seen in 8 years? A day, she told herself. Just one more day. It was an illogical, foolish bargain with a fate that had never been kind to her. But she made it all the same. She would watch the stage leave. If the world did not end, if the sky did not fall, she would book passage on the next one, with a heavy heart. She watched the coach pull away, its departure stirring the ever-present dust into a swirling, red ghost that soon vanished down the road. She had made a choice, and the profound sense of relief that washed over her was as terrifying as it was welcome. Later that morning, the Golden Spur was buzzing with a venomous energy. It was a sound Eliza knew well. It was the sound of a reputation being torn to shreds. She was polishing glasses behind the bar when she caught the name, spoken in a hushed, excited tone by a pair of prospectors. Remington. The story, passed from man to man like a bottle of cheap whiskey, grew with each telling. A prospector. Jedediah Hines had been found dead out by Cripple Creek, a single bullet hole in his back. Hines had been loudly and publicly arguing with Cole Remington over a claim that bordered the Rocking R Ranch for weeks. Hines had a reputation for being a blowhard and a cheat, but he was a local. Cole Remington, for all his wealth, was still an outsider. By noon, the rumor had solidified into fact in the court of public opinion. Sheriff McGraw, flanked by Haskins and 2 other deputies, made a grand show of striding into the saloon. He was a man who fed on the fear and failings of others, and today he was feasting. His eyes, small and dark like a pig's, scanned the room, settling on Eliza for a moment too long. A smug, proprietary smile touched his lips, a look that always made her skin crawl. "Just want to let you folks know, McGraw announced, his voice booming with false sincerity. "That the law is handling the situation with Jedediah Hines. No one is above justice in Dust Valley. Not even a rich man like Cole Remington." He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words settle. "I will be riding out to the Rocking R to ask Mr. Remington some questions, for his own protection. I will also be placing the ranch under the temporary stewardship of the county until this matter is resolved." It was a land grab, pure and simple, dressed up in the colors of the law. Eliza felt a cold dread seep into her bones. This was how it had started with her father. A whisper, an accusation, and then McGraw, moving in like a vulture to pick the bones clean. She watched him leave, the jingle of his spurs a cheerful, predatory sound. The afternoon dragged on. The air was thick with speculation and a kind of grim excitement. Eliza worked in a daze, her thoughts a prayer for Cole to be far away, to have seen this coming. But just as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows down the main street, he rode into town on a big bay gelding. He was leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. He had clearly been out on the range, ignorant of the storm gathering in his name. He had not even dismounted in front of the general store when McGraw and his men emerged from the sheriff's office to intercept him. Eliza was at the saloon swinging doors, ostensibly wiping down the wood, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Remington," McGraw called out, his voice slick with manufactured authority. "Got a warrant here for your arrest, for the murder of Jedediah Hines." Cole slowly swung down from his horse. He looked at the paper McGraw held out, then at the faces of the deputies, their expressions a mixture of fear and eagerness. He showed no surprise, no alarm. His face was a calm, unreadable mask. "Hines is dead, that is a shame, but it has nothing to do with me." "He was found on the edge of your property, shot in the back," McGraw said, "enjoying himself. Plenty of folks heard you threatening him." "I told him to stop trespassing and to stop diverting water from the creek," Cole said, his voice even. "That is not a threat. It is a statement of fact." "Sounds like a motive to me," Haskins sneered, stepping forward. "Where were you last night?" "Remington." Cole's gaze remained on McGraw. "I was on my own land, alone." "Convenient," McGraw chuckled. "Well, you can tell your story to a judge, assuming we can find one that is not on your payroll." He nodded to his men. "Take him." Two deputies moved to grab Cole's arms, but he shrugged them off. "I will come peacefully. There is no need for this." That was when Haskins, still smarting from the humiliation in the street the day before, saw his chance. He swung a fist, a heavy, brutal blow that caught Cole on the side of the head. Cole staggered, a grunt of pain escaping his lips. Before he could recover, the other deputies swarmed him, their fear of him momentarily forgotten in the frenzy of the pack. They wrestled him to the ground. A sickening thud echoed as a boot connected with his ribs. Eliza cried out, her hand flying to her mouth. The world narrowed to that single, brutal tableau in the dust. An innocent man, her mind screamed, another innocent man being devoured by this town, by this corrupt sheriff. The faces in the small crowd that had gathered were apathetic, some even pleased to see the wealthy rancher brought low. No one would speak for him. No one would help him. Just like with her father. And in that instant, something inside her snapped. The years of quiet endurance, of swallowing her grief and her rage. It all broke apart. She was moving before she even knew what she was doing, pushing through the swinging doors, her mind a blaze of desperate, reckless fire. She pushed her way through the onlookers, her eyes locked on McGraw. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice ringing with a strength she did not know she possessed. "Leave him alone." The deputies paused, surprised by the interruption. McGraw turned, a look of annoyance on his face that quickly turned to amusement when he saw it was her. "Well, look what we have here." The little saloon girl has something to say. Eliza's heart was a wild bird beating against her ribs, but she did not back down. She looked at Cole, who was being hauled to his feet, blood trickling from a cut on his temple. His gray eyes found hers, and in them she saw a flicker of disbelief and a silent warning to stay away. She ignored it. "You asked where he was last night," she said, her voice shaking but clear. She took a breath, the lie forming on her lips, huge and terrifying and necessary. "He cannot have been anywhere near Cripple Creek, because he was with me." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, judgmental blanket. She had not just lied. She had thrown her own name, her own virtue, into the fire to save him. McGraw stared at her, his amusement replaced by a cold fury. He had not anticipated this. He had not anticipated her. "With you all night." "Yes," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching, though it felt like staring into the eyes of a snake. "All night. In my room. At the saloon." The lie hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. It was a perfect alibi. A saloon girl's reputation was already tarnished. Who would question her for having a man in her room, and who would dare question the word of the richest man in the valley if he chose to confirm it? Cole, standing between the two deputies, slowly straightened up. The surprise in his eyes was replaced by a look of profound, aching gratitude. He understood the price she was paying with every word. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "That is right, Sheriff. I was with Miss Hart." McGraw was trapped. His case, built on rumor and opportunity, had just crumbled. To challenge the alibi would be to challenge a man he was not yet ready to face directly, and to call out a woman whose reputation was now, in a way, shielding them both. His face was a thundercloud of thwarted rage. "Get out of here, Remington," he snarled, shoving Cole forward. "But I will be watching you." Cole did not spare him a glance. He walked over to Eliza, his steps unsteady. He stopped in front of her, ignoring the whispers and the hostile stares of the townsfolk. He reached out as if to touch her arm, then let his hand drop. There were no words that could cover the chasm that had just opened up between her and the world she knew. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice low and rough. Then he turned, collected his horse, and rode out of town, leaving her to face the consequences alone. The crowd did not disperse. They stared. The women, in particular, looked at her with a new and vicious contempt. Mrs. Gable, the butcher's wife, who had always had a kind word for Eliza, pulled her skirts aside as if Eliza were carrying a plague. The whispers started, sharp and cruel. She was no better than a common whore. She had sold herself to a killer for money. She turned and walked back toward the Golden Spur, each step an act of will. She could feel the weight of their judgment like a physical shroud. Mr. Abernathy, the saloon's owner, was waiting for her just inside the doors. He was a decent man, but he was a businessman first. "Eliza," he said, his voice full of a weary regret. "I cannot have this kind of trouble here. You know how it is. You need to pack your things. I am sorry." She just nodded, unable to speak. She walked through the now silent saloon and up the stairs to her room. Her valise was still by the door where she had left it. She had sacrificed her name, her job, and her last foothold in this town, all for a man she barely knew. She had done it in a moment of righteous fury, a desperate attempt to stop history from repeating itself. Later that evening, as she sat on her bed in the dark room, there was another knock on her door. It was McGraw. He did not ask to come in. He simply opened the door and stood there, filling the frame, blocking out the light from the hall. "You made a fool of me today. Girl," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I do not like being made a fool." Eliza stood up, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. "I told the truth." He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "We both know what you did. You threw yourself in the mud for him, but I am a forgiving man." He took a step into the room. A town can be made to forget. Reputations can be mended. A girl like you, All alone now. You need protection. A man like me can provide that. He let the offer hang in the air, its sordid meaning perfectly clear. He was offering her a trade. Her body for his silence, his protection. She could become his creature, his property, and the town would learn to leave her alone. You have made your choice for Remington, he went on, his eyes roaming over her in the dim light. Now you can make a choice for yourself. You can be an outcast, or you can be smart. He smiled that terrible smile again. You think about it. I will be back. He closed the door, leaving her alone in the darkness, the silence of the room. A tomb. She had saved one man from injustice, only to be trapped by the very source of it. She was more alone than ever, with a new and far more personal monster now lurking at her door. The silence Sheriff McGraw left behind was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Eliza stood in the center of her room, the darkness pressing in on her, and felt a tremor of pure, animal fear. He would be back. That was not a threat. It was a promise. Her options had narrowed to a single, terrible point. She could submit to his vile proposition, becoming his creature, or she could run into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and a name that was now worthless. She moved to the window, her hands shaking, and peered down into the back alley. Escape? The word was a frantic prayer in her mind. But where could she go on foot? McGraw's men would find her before she made it 5 miles. Every direction led to an open plain or unforgiving mountains. She was trapped. A sob of despair, the first she had allowed herself in years, caught in her throat. A faint scratching sound at the window pane made her jump. Her blood ran cold. He was back already. She flattened herself against the wall, her heart seizing with terror, trying to make herself invisible. The sound came again, a light, insistent tap. It was not the sound of a man trying to break in. It was a signal, holding her breath. She crept back to the window. In the deep shadows of the alley below, a tall figure stood next to the saloon's water barrel. Cole Remington. Relief washed over her so powerfully her knees went weak. She fumbled with the window latch, pushing the sash up just enough to whisper down to him. What are you doing here? You have to go. If they find you. I am not leaving you here. His voice came back, a low, urgent rumble. I saw McGraw go up to your room. I waited. What did he do? Eliza. The use of her first name, the raw concern in his voice, nearly broke her. He made me an offer, she whispered, the words tasting like poison. A long silence stretched from the alley below. Even in the darkness, she could feel the change in him, a coiling of cold, dangerous anger. When he spoke again, his voice was flat and hard as granite. Pack what you need. We are leaving, now. We cannot, she argued, her voice frantic. They will be watching the roads. There is more than one way out of a town like this, he replied. I have horses waiting in the cottonwoods by the creek. Can you get down the back stairs without being seen? She nodded, then realized he could not see her. Yes, the back door is never locked. Good. Do not bring a lamp. Meet me by the horses. Go now. He melted back into the deeper shadows and was gone. For a moment, she was paralyzed by the sheer recklessness of it all. Then the image of McGraw's leering smile flashed in her mind, and it spurred her into action. She did not need to pack. Her valise was already waiting. She slung its strap over her shoulder, took one last look at the small room that had been her prison for 8 years, and slipped out into the darkened hallway. The saloon below was quiet, the last of the drinkers having staggered home. The air was stale with the ghosts of spilled whiskey and shattered dreams. She moved like a phantom down the narrow back stairs, her hand trailing along the rough wooden wall. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The back door opened onto the alley with a soft groan. The cool night air was a shock to her senses. For a moment, she stood there, a shadow among shadows. And then she ran, her worn boots making no sound in the thick dust. He was waiting, as promised, In a thick grove of cottonwood trees on the bank of the shallow creek that marked the town's eastern edge, 2 horses stood saddled and ready, their reins in his hands. He had her valise tied down behind his saddle before she even caught her breath. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice low. "I can stay on a horse," she answered. He gave a curt nod and helped her mount. The leather of the saddle was cool and solid beneath her. He swung up onto his own horse, and without another word, urged his mount into the creek. They rode in the water for a half-mile, the quiet splashing of the hooves masked by the rustle of the wind in the leaves. It was an old trick to hide their trail, and it told her that this was not the first time Cole Remington had needed to disappear into the night. Once they were clear of the town, he guided them onto a narrow game trail that wound its way up into the rocky hills. The moon was a sliver of bone in a sky full of cold, indifferent stars. They rode in silence, the only sound the rhythmic clopping of hooves on stone and the sigh of the wind. Eliza clung to the saddle horn, every muscle in her body tense. She was a fugitive, fleeing a town that wanted to consume her, with a man who was practically a stranger, a man who was now a wanted murderer in the eyes of the law. And yet, she felt a sliver of something she had not felt in a very long time, a fragile, terrifying hope. They had been riding for nearly 2 hours when the sky began to change. The stars vanished, swallowed by a bank of thick, dark clouds rolling in from the west. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and damp earth. A low rumble of thunder echoed through the hills. They were in a narrow, rocky canyon when the first shot rang out. It came from the ridge above them, the muzzle flash a brief, angry spark in the darkness. The bullet whined past Eliza's ear, close enough for her to feel its heat, and slammed into the rock wall beside her. Her horse screamed and reared in panic. She would have been thrown if not for Cole's iron grip suddenly on her arm, steadying her. "Get down," he yelled, his voice cutting through the rising wind. Another shot cracked the night, and he grunted, his body lurching in the saddle. He spurred his horse forward, pulling her along with him. "Ride, do not stop." They galloped through the canyon, rocks and brush a blur in the deepening gloom. More shots followed, but they were wild, the shooters firing blindly into the darkness. Rain began to fall, thick, cold drops that quickly became a torrential downpour. The trail became a slick, treacherous ribbon of mud. The thunder was louder now, a furious cannonade that shook the very ground beneath them. Cole led them off the trail, into a dense stand of pines that offered some cover. He finally pulled their horses to a halt in the lee of a massive rock formation. The rain was a solid, roaring curtain around them. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice strained. "No," she said, her own voice trembling. "But you are. I heard you." "It is just a graze," he said, but in a flash of lightning, she saw his left sleeve was dark and soaked with more than just rain. His face was pale, his jaw set in a hard line against the pain. "We have to stop," she insisted. "We have to tend to that arm." He scanned the darkness, his eyes searching. Another flash of lightning illuminated a dark shape nestled against the side of the hill not 50 yards away. It was a small, dilapidated structure, barely more than a shack, an old trapper's cabin, long abandoned. "There," he said. "We will wait out the storm there." He led the horses to the cabin, tying them in the relative shelter of a thicket of trees. The cabin door hung on one hinge, but the roof, made of thick sod, looked mostly intact. Inside, it was dark and smelled of damp earth, old smoke, and pine needles. Cole stumbled as he came through the door, and she caught his arm, her hand coming away wet and sticky. He found a dry stack of wood next to the stone hearth and, with surprising speed, used his flint and steel to coax a small flame to life. As the fire grew, it pushed back the darkness, revealing a single, primitive room. A rough-hewn table and a single stool were the only furniture, but it was dry, a refuge from the raging storm outside. "Let me see your arm," she said, her voice gentle but firm. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. sinking down onto the floor with his back against the wall, his face etched with pain and exhaustion. She carefully cut away the sleeve of his shirt. The bullet had torn a nasty furrow along the outside of his upper arm. It was not deep, but it was bleeding freely. She opened her valise, thankful she had brought her small store of medical supplies. She cleaned the wound with whiskey from a flask he carried, hissing a sharp breath through his teeth, but never making a sound. The flickering firelight danced across the taut muscles of his shoulders and cast deep shadows on his face, a landscape of hard lines and quiet suffering. As she worked, wrapping the wound with clean strips of linen, the silence between them was filled only by the crackle of the fire and the steady drumming of the rain on the roof. The warmth of the small room, the shared danger, the simple, intimate act of tending to his injury, it all combined to strip away the barriers between them. He was not the wealthy rancher, and she was not the saloon girl. They were just a man and a woman, fugitives in the night, finding a moment of peace in the heart of a storm. When she finished, she sat back on her heels. Her hands were still on his arm. She could feel the heat of his skin, the steady, strong pulse beneath her fingertips. He was watching her, his gray eyes dark and unreadable in the firelight. "You lost everything because of me," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. She shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "No, Cole, I made a choice. For the first time in a long time, I chose to do something instead of just letting things happen to me. I would do it again." He looked down at her hands on his arm, then back up to her face. A deep, profound sadness was in his eyes, a vulnerability she had never expected to see. He looked like a man who had been alone for a very long time. "My plan was to go to Denver," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "To start over. A new life." He did not speak for a long moment, his gaze searching hers. The storm raged outside, a wild and violent thing, but inside their small shelter, the world had become very still. "You can leave this town. Eliza," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. He reached up with his good hand and gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray drop of rainwater. "But do not leave me behind." His words hung in the air of the small cabin, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their separate lives. "Do not leave me behind." It was not a demand, but a plea from a place of profound loneliness, a confession of a need he had likely never voiced before. Eliza looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the wealthy rancher and the formidable man who had faced down McGraw's deputies. She saw a soul as weathered and solitary as the rocky hills around them. She had been so focused on her own escape, her own pain, that she had failed to see his. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The storm outside was a wild, untamed thing, but inside their small haven, a quiet accord had been reached. She would not abandon him, not now. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet pine and rich earth. The sky was a pale, tender blue, and the air was crisp and cool. They left the cabin without a word, moving with a shared, unspoken purpose. Cole's arm was stiff and sore, but he refused to let it slow him down. He led them not back toward the main trails, but deeper into the rugged, untamed country at the valley's northern rim. It was a landscape of towering pines, hidden meadows, and stone formations that looked like ancient, sleeping giants. After several hours of hard riding, they crested a ridge, and Cole pulled his horse to a halt. Below them, nestled in a small, sheltered bowl of land, was a homestead, or what was left of one. A small log house stood with a sagging porch and a caved-in section of roof. A collapsed corral fence lay like a skeleton in the tall grass, and a stone chimney stood sentinel, covered in ivy. It was a ghost of a place, a testament to a dream that had long since died. "What is this place?" Eliza asked, her voice hushed. "It was mine," Cole said, his gaze fixed on the ruin below. "The first piece of land I ever owned. Before the rocking R, I built it with my own hands. He nudged his horse forward, down the gentle slope. "McGraw does not know about this place. No one does. We will be safe here for a while." Safe. It was a word Eliza had almost forgotten the meaning of. As they drew closer, the extent of the decay became clear. The wind and the winters had been unkind. Yet, there was a strength to the way the main cabin still stood, a stubborn refusal to be erased completely. It was a place of deep sadness, but also of a strange, lingering peace. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was entirely new to both of them. Their first task was survival, and that meant making the cabin habitable. It was hard, grueling work. But it was a shared labor that forged a new kind of bond between them, stronger than words. Cole, despite the pain in his arm, was a man of relentless energy. With an axe he had carried in his pack, he felled a young pine and began splitting logs to patch the hole in the roof. He moved with an economy of motion, a deep, ingrained knowledge of the work that spoke of a life lived far from the comfort his current wealth suggested. Eliza, in turn, took command of the inside of the cabin. She swept out the years of accumulated leaves and dust, the nest of a pack rat, the ghosts of the past. She found a rusty bucket and hauled water from a clear, cold spring she discovered a short walk away. She used her knowledge of herbs to find wild mint and yarrow, brewing teas that soothed his pain and kept infection from his wound. She mended the torn clothes they had worn during their escape, her small needle and thread a tool of restoration. Together, they were rebuilding not just a structure, but a sanctuary. In the small, shared acts of the day, they began to truly see each other. She saw the patience in his hands as he carefully reset a loose stone in the hearth. He saw the fierce determination in her eyes as she scrubbed the grime from a window pane, letting in the light. One afternoon, while he was on the roof, he slipped on a patch of damp moss. He did not fall, but a shower of dirt and bark rained down on her. She looked up, her face smudged with soot, and a genuine, unforced laugh escaped her lips. He looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw him smile. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it transformed his hard face, chasing the shadows from his eyes. In the evenings, they would sit before a crackling fire, the silence comfortable, the shared warmth a bulwark against the vast, lonely wilderness outside. It was on one of those nights, as she was changing the bandage on his arm, that he finally began to speak of his past. "This place looks better than the sod house I grew up in back in Missouri," he said, his voice quiet, his gaze lost in the flames. "My father was a sharecropper. He worked himself into an early grave trying to pay off a debt to a man who kept changing the numbers. He spoke of hunger, of a childhood spent in dirt-floored cabins and the bitter cold of winters with too little food and not enough firewood. He told her he had left home at 15 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a belief that there had to be something better somewhere. "I did what I had to do to survive," he continued, his voice dropping lower, taking on a hard, rough edge. "I worked on the railroad, in mines, and when times were lean, I hired out my gun. I was fast, faster than most. I rode with men I am not proud of, and I did things I wish I could forget." Eliza stopped her work, her hand still on his arm. She looked at his face, at the self-loathing etched there. This was the source of his solitude, the reason for the walls he built around himself. "I never shot a man who did not have it coming," he said, as if trying to convince himself as much as her. "But it is a dark road to walk. Eliza, it changes you. It hollows you out." He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a raw, painful honesty. "I saved every cent I made. I was haunted by the memory of my father, of being poor and helpless. I swore I would never be that man. I came to Wyoming, bought this piece of land, and started over. I left the gun behind. I thought I had." Here it was, the truth behind the whispers. He was not just a rich man with a mysterious past. He was a man who had clawed his way out of a darkness she could barely imagine. A man who had tried to build a new life on a foundation of regret. Her heart ached for him, for the boy he had been and the man he had forced himself to become. She saw now that his kindness, his defense of the O'Malley boy, was not a random act. It was a deliberate rebellion against the man he used to be. She finished tying the bandage and let her hand rest on his. "You are not that man anymore." "Cole." He looked at their joined hands, a strange, wondering expression on his face. "With you," he said softly. "I am beginning to believe that." A week passed, then another. The cabin became a home. The hole in the roof was patched, the door hung straight and true, and the window was no longer broken. They had created a small island of order in the vast wilderness. But Eliza knew it could not last. McGraw would not give up his search, and her dream of Denver, though faded, still whispered to her in the quiet moments. It was a safe dream, a clean dream, untainted by murder accusations and men with guns. One afternoon, while Cole was out checking the snares he had set for rabbits, she pulled her valise from under the bunk she had made for herself. She opened it, the scent of lavender from a sachet she had packed long ago rising to meet her. She ran her hand over the neatly folded calico dresses. It was the life she had wanted, the woman she had planned to be. Staying here with Cole was a beautiful, impossible dream. His past would always be a shadow over them. Sooner or later, it would find them. She began to repack the few items that had been scattered around the cabin, her movements slow and deliberate. It was the hardest thing she had ever had to do. Each folded item felt like a betrayal. She was placing the small, carved bird on top of her shawl when he appeared in the doorway. He was silent, but his presence filled the small cabin. He looked at the open valise, then at her face, and an expression of profound hurt, deeper than any physical wound, settled in his eyes. She stood up, her heart a painful knot in her chest. "Cole, She did not know what to say. That she was a coward, that she was afraid that his world was too dangerous for her. He did not let her finish. He crossed the room in 2 long strides. He did not speak. He simply reached for her, his hands gentle but firm on her arms. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her in an embrace that was both a plea and a declaration. He held her against the solid wall of his chest, and she could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart. She could smell the scent of pine and wood smoke on his clothes, the scent of him. He rested his cheek against her hair, his voice a low, rough murmur against her ear. "I am not rich in gold, Eliza," he said, and she could feel the truth of the words resonate through his entire body. "I never have been. What I had, McGraw is likely picking over right now, but I am rich in knowing what I want, and that is you." The words shattered the last of her resolve, all the fear, all the carefully constructed plans for a safe and lonely future. They all fell away. She lifted her head, and her eyes, shining with unshed tears, met his. The setting sun slanted through the newly repaired window, filling the small cabin with a warm, golden light. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them into a shower of gold. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of a deep and certain knowing. It was a kiss of homecoming, of finding a harbor after a lifetime at sea. It was gentle and it was sure, a promise made in the golden light of a setting sun. For the first time, love was not a risk or a danger, but a simple, profound truth, acknowledged in the heart of the wilderness they had, for a moment, made their own. The weeks that followed were a dream suspended in time, a golden bubble of peace in a world that should not have allowed it. The derelict cabin became a home, filled with the scent of rabbit stew and the low murmur of their voices. They worked from sunup to sundown, their shared purpose a silent language between them. Cole taught her how to read the tracks of deer and the habits of grouse. She taught him the names of the wildflowers that grew in the meadow, and showed him which roots were good for medicine. They were Adam and Eve in a rugged, forgotten Eden, building a life from the scraps the world had left behind. In the quiet of the nights, wrapped in a single rough blanket before the fire, he would talk, and she would listen. He spoke of the men he had ridden with, their faces hard and their souls empty, and of the gnawing loneliness of a life spent looking over his shoulder. She, in turn, spoke of her father, of his kindness and his quiet integrity, and of the crushing weight of grief and injustice she had carried alone for so many years. They were trading their sorrows, lightening each other's burdens, their pasts weaving together to form the tapestry of a shared present. Love, Eliza discovered, was not a grand declaration. It was the simple, profound act of being seen, truly and completely, by another human being. But even in their sanctuary, the outside world was a constant, looming threat. Sometimes, a high-riding hawk would cast a shadow over the meadow, and Eliza's heart would leap into her throat, the fear of discovery a cold, familiar companion. Cole saw it in her eyes. He began to spend more time patrolling the ridges around their small valley, his rifle ever present in his hands, his face settling back into the hard, watchful lines she had first seen in Dust Valley. The peace was a fragile thing, and they both knew it. Back in town, Sheriff Barton McGraw was not a man to let a grudge go. He was being eaten alive by his failure to break Cole Remington and the humiliation of being thwarted by a saloon girl. The disappearance of the two of them was an open sore on his authority. He put a bounty on Remington's head, a quiet one, passed among the kind of men who drift from town to town, their morals as thin as their bedrolls. He also worked the law to his own ends, holding a town meeting where he spoke gravely of the murdered prospector, Jedediah Hines, and the fugitive rancher who had cheated justice. With a heavy heart, he informed the assembled citizens he was petitioning the territorial government to seize the assets of the Rocking R to be sold at auction to pay for the county's troubles. It was a lie wrapped in a legal document, and the town, cowed into submission, did nothing to stop him. One of the men who heard the whispers of McGraw's bounty was a tracker named Finn, a wiry, silent man with eyes that missed nothing. For a week, he scoured the hills, following the trail from the canyon where the ambush had taken place. It was a cold trail, washed out by the storm, but Finn was patient. He found the abandoned cabin and saw the signs of their stay. He then began to cast a wide, slow circle, looking for the place they had gone next. His break came in the form of a small, pearlescent button, half buried in the mud near a spring. He recognized it as the kind a woman might have on her dress. He knew then that they had not fled the territory. They were hiding, living off the land. They were close. The attack came just after dusk. Eliza was cleaning their tin plates by the fire, while Cole stood in the open doorway, his gaze sweeping the line of trees at the edge of the clearing. A profound stillness had fallen, the kind where the birds and insects go silent all at once. It was the quiet of a predator's approach. "Get inside," Cole said, his voice a low, urgent command. He did not turn to look at her and bar the door. She moved without question, her heart beginning a frantic, panicked drumbeat. She slid the heavy wooden bar they had fashioned into place just as the first rifle shot exploded the night. The bullet tore through the wooden door, splintering the wood inches from her head. She threw herself to the floor, her hands over her head, as another shot shattered the window she had so carefully repaired. Cole was already moving, a shadow in the deepening twilight. He had not stayed in the cabin, knowing it was a trap. From the cover of a thicket of pines, he returned fire, his shots measured and precise. He was not trying to win a battle. He was trying to buy her time. "Eliza!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The horses are tethered in the gully behind the cabin. You have to run!" "No," she screamed back, her voice choked with terror. "I will not leave you." "There are too many of them," he shouted, his words punctuated by another volley of gunfire. "Go, I will draw their fire. Go now." She crawled to the back wall of the cabin, where a small opening, barely a window, looked out toward the gully. She could hear them now, men moving through the trees, calling to each other, their voices rough and predatory. They were closing in. She knew Cole was right. To stay was to die with him. To run was to have a chance, however slim. Sobbing, she scrambled through the opening, scraping her hands and knees on the rough logs. She found the horses, their eyes wide with terror, pulling at their reins. As she fumbled with the knots, she could hear the fight shifting, the sound of the gunfire moving away from the cabin as Cole led his attackers on a desperate chase through the woods. He was sacrificing himself for her. The realization was a blade in her heart. She swung herself onto her horse's back and dug her heels in, plunging into the darkness, the sounds of the battle fading behind her. She rode all night, a ghost fleeing through a landscape of moon-cast shadows. By dawn, she was miles away, hidden deep in the mountains, her horse exhausted. She was alone, and she was free, but it was a hollow, worthless freedom. The image of Cole, turning to face a half-dozen guns to save her, was burned into her mind. She thought of her father, of his lonely, unjust death, of her own years of helpless rage. She had run then, run into a shell of silent grief. She could run now. She could ride east, find her way to Denver, and disappear. She could have the life she always wanted. But what life would it be? Knowing she had left the only man she had ever loved to face McGraw's vengeance alone, the life she had built with him in that small cabin, a life of shared work and quiet trust, was more real and more precious than any dream of a clean, safe future in a faraway city. She would not run this time. Her father had died because no one had the courage to stand up. She would not let that happen again. A new resolve, cold and hard as iron, settled in her. She turned her horse around and began the long ride back to Dust Valley. She had one weapon left, a desperate, long-forgotten hope. In a small, oilskin pouch at the bottom of her valise were her father's things, the small carved bird, a few letters from his sister, and a thin leather-bound ledger. Her father, a meticulous carpenter, had recorded every job he ever did. He had also, she now remembered with a jolt, made notes of his dealings with the town. He had suspected McGraw's corruption long before anyone else dared to whisper it. He had written it all down. She rode into Dust Valley in the middle of the afternoon. She was a ragged, wild-looking figure, her hair matted, her face scratched and smudged with dirt. But she rode with her head held high, and the people who saw her fell silent, their jeers and whispers dying on their lips. There was something in her eyes, a fire they had never seen before, and they instinctively moved out of her way. They had Cole locked in one of the cells in the sheriff's office. A circuit judge, a weary, whiskey-sodden man named Peters, had arrived that morning. McGraw, eager to legitimize his seizure of Cole's property and his arrest, had convened an immediate hearing in the Golden Spur. The saloon was packed, the mood a mix of morbid curiosity and fear. Eliza pushed her way through the swinging doors just as McGraw was describing, with great dramatic flair, the capture of the dangerous fugitive, Cole Remington. All heads turned toward her. A shocked silence fell over the room. Cole, standing between two deputies, his face bruised and his hands bound, looked at her with a mixture of horror and despair. He thought she had come to give herself up. "What is the meaning of this?" McGraw bellowed, his face turning a blotchy red. Eliza walked to the front of the room, to the makeshift judge's bench where Judge Peters sat. She did not look at McGraw. She looked at the faces of the townsfolk, Mrs. Gable, who had shunned her, Mr. Abernathy, who had fired her, men whose wounds she had tended, whose secrets she had kept. "Before you pass judgment on that man," she said, her voice clear and strong, "you should know that I lied to you." A murmur ran through the crowd. Cole's shoulders slumped in defeat. "I lied when I said Cole Remington was with me on the night Jedediah Hines was killed," she continued, her voice ringing with a terrible, liberating honesty. "I was not with him. I have no idea where he was." She paused, letting the weight of her confession sink in. I lied to save an innocent man from a monster, the same monster who killed my father 8 years ago. She turned and pointed a trembling finger directly at Sheriff McGraw. He is the real criminal in this valley. McGraw laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. The girl is hysterical, Your Honor. Her father was a convicted traitor, and she is the whore of a murderer. My father, Eliza said, her voice cutting through his, was an honest man, and he was a careful man. She reached into her valise and pulled out the old leather ledger. She slapped it down on the table in front of Judge Peters. My father kept records. He recorded every dealing he had with this town, and with this man. He recorded the time Sheriff McGraw forced him to sign over a deed to a small parcel of land to cover a tax that did not exist. He recorded the inflated invoices for lumber for the new jail. Lumber McGraw's own cousin supplied at twice the going rate. He recorded the protection money the sheriff demanded from Mr. Abernathy, right here in this saloon. She opened the book, her hands sure and steady now. The room was utterly silent. She began to read, her voice clear and damning, citing dates, names, and amounts. She read about merchants being shaken down, about cattle disappearing from small ranches, about votes being bought and sold. It was a meticulous, damning account of years of petty theft and corruption that had bled the town dry. As she spoke, a change began to ripple through the crowd. A man from the general store nodded grimly. The blacksmith, a big, quiet man, spoke up. That is true, he said, his voice a low rumble. McGraw made me pay for a license I never needed. Another voice, then another, joined in. A rancher's wife tearfully recounted how they had lost their water rights. Mr. Abernathy, his face pale, confirmed the story of the protection money. The dam of fear that had held the town in its grip for years was breaking. The whispers became a roar of accusation, all of it directed at the stunned, furious man wearing the sheriff's star. Eliza had not just brought evidence, she had given them back their courage. The darkness was finally being dragged into the light. The saloon, which moments before had been a makeshift courtroom, erupted into a chaotic sea of righteous fury. The simmering resentment of years had finally boiled over, and the target was Sheriff Barton McGraw. He stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, as the men he had bullied and extorted for so long began to press in on him. His deputies, Haskins included, took one look at the ugly mood of the crowd and the damning evidence in the ledger, and they backed away. Their tin stars suddenly feeling very heavy and worthless. They were McGraw's men when he was the wolf, but they had no intention of being his sheep at the slaughter. "Seize him!" the blacksmith roared, his voice like thunder, and that was all it took. A dozen hands grabbed McGraw, stripping the gun from his hip and the star from his chest. He cursed and struggled, but the collective strength of the townspeople, a force he had never respected, was now his undoing. They dragged him, spitting and wild-eyed, to the very jail he had run as his personal kingdom, and threw him into a cell. The heavy iron door clanged shut, a sound of final, resounding justice that echoed through the entire town. In the midst of the chaos, Eliza stood by the judge's bench, her body trembling with the aftermath of her stand. Cole was beside her, his hands now unbound, his touch a warm, grounding pressure on her arm. He looked from her face to the ledger, then back again. His eyes filled with a wonder and a gratitude so profound it left him speechless. He saw not a saloon girl, not a liar, but a woman with a spirit forged from her father's steel and a courage that humbled him. Judge Peters, who had sobered up considerably during the proceedings, cleared his throat, bringing a semblance of order back to the room. In light of this testimony and this remarkable evidence, he said, tapping the ledger, Barton McGraw will be held for the territorial marshal. He will face trial for corruption, extortion, and likely a dozen other charges. He then turned his weary, red-rimmed eyes to Cole. Which brings us to you, Mr. Remington. A hush fell over the room once more. The town had vanquished one monster, but another, more complicated matter remained. You stood in this room and confessed, of your own free will, to having been a hired gun, the judge said, his voice heavy with the impartial weight of the law. You have admitted to a past that involves violence for pay. While your name is not on any current wanted posters that I know of, I cannot, in good conscience, simply let that go. Cole nodded slowly, his expression grim. He had known this was coming. I understand. Your Honor, I am therefore placing you under arrest, the judge continued. You will be held in the custody of this town, which seems to have found its civic voice again, until I can consult with the territorial prosecutor. We will have to determine what, if any, outstanding warrants exist for you under other names, and whether your past actions constitute crimes that can still be tried. It was a cruel and bitter irony. Cole was to be locked in the cell next to the very man who had tried to destroy him. 2 deputies, their faces a mixture of newfound duty and embarrassment, stepped forward. Cole did not resist. He looked at Eliza, his eyes conveying a silent, aching apology. Then they led him away, leaving her standing alone in the center of the saloon, the cheers for McGraw's downfall dying in her ears, replaced by the cold silence of a new and terrible reality. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty. Dust Valley, in a state of shock and cautious optimism, appointed the blacksmith as a temporary lawman. The townsfolk treated Eliza with a new, reverent respect. They called her a hero, Mrs. Gable brought her a freshly baked pie, her eyes full of shame for her past judgment. Mr. Abernathy offered her job back, with a raise and a heartfelt apology, but their praise felt hollow, their respect a burden. She had not done it for them. She had done it for Cole. And now, he was the one in chains. She visited him every day. The cell was small and dark, a cage of iron and shadow. They would talk through the bars, their hands reaching for each other in the small space between them. He never complained. He was calm, resolute, accepting of his fate. He was overwhelmed with gratitude for what she had done, for her courage. You saved my life, Eliza, he told her one afternoon, his voice a low rumble. Not just from McGraw. You saved me from the man I used to be. You gave me something to believe in. She wanted to find comfort in his words, in the deep, unwavering love she saw in his eyes. But all she felt was a cold, creeping dread. She listened to the whispers in the town. They called her a hero now, but they still remembered her lie. And they remembered Cole's confession. The story of his past was taking on a life of its own. Men who had lost money at cards years ago now claimed to have seen him on the wrong side of a cattle war. Every unsolved crime, every rumor of a faceless gunslinger, was now being laid at his door. His past, once a private shame, had become a public spectacle. She began to see their future not as the peaceful life they had started to build in the cabin, but as an endless series of courtrooms and whispers. She would be forever the saloon girl who lied for her lover, and he would be the killer who had bought his way to respectability. His past was a stain that could never be washed away, and by loving him, she had smeared it all over herself. It would poison everything they tried to build. It would follow their children, if they were ever to have them. She had fought so hard to clear her father's name, only to tie herself to a man whose name might be forever condemned. The realization settled in her heart like a stone. To love him was to destroy them both. The only way to save what they had, the pure and perfect thing they had found in that cabin, was to leave it behind, to protect him from her reputation, and to free herself from the shadow of his. It was a choice born, not of fear, but of a desperate, heartbreaking love. That evening, she went back to her old room above the saloon. Mr. Abernathy had insisted she stay there, free of charge. The room was the same, but she was different. Everything was different. She pulled her worn leather valise from the corner. It felt heavier this time, weighted down with a sorrow that was almost too much to bear. She began to pack, her movements slow, almost ritualistic. The calico dresses, the shawl, the small, carved bird. Each item was a memory of a choice, a step on a road that had led her to this impossible moment. Denver. The word was no longer a talisman of hope. It was a sentence of exile. She had just closed the tarnished clasps when the door opened. Cole stood there. The blacksmith, seeing no harm in it, had let him out of his cell for an hour, to stretch his legs and get a decent meal. He was not supposed to leave the jailhouse, but he had come straight here. He knew. He had seen it in her eyes that afternoon. He looked at her, then at the valise by her feet. His face was a mask of quiet, profound pain. He did not look angry. He looked like a man watching his entire world prepare to walk out the door.
"Do not do this, Eliza,"
he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "I have to," she whispered, tears finally breaking free and tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Can you not see? They will never let you forget who you were, and they will never let me forget my lie. We will be ghosts. Cole, haunted by our own pasts for the rest of our lives. I cannot live like that, and I will not do that to you." He crossed the room and stood before her. He looked down at her, at the fierce, desperate love that was tearing her apart, and his own heart broke for her. He understood her fear. He had lived with that same ghost his entire life. She picked up the valise, the finality of the act a fresh wave of grief. "I have to go." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers, strong and sure. His other hand came to rest on the valise, stopping her. His touch was not a restraint, but an anchor. "If you are leaving," he said, his voice a raw, unshakable vow, "you are not going without me." She stared at him, her tear-filled eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you talking about? You are a prisoner. You have to stand trial." "Then we will leave after," he said, "or we will leave now. It does not matter. I am not letting you face this world alone. Not anymore." The sheer, reckless certainty in his voice stole her breath. "Then where will we go?" she asked. The question a cry of despair, of a soul that had run for so long it had forgotten how to stand still. What life could we possibly have? He pulled her closer, his gaze burning into hers, his grip on her hand a promise of a future she had not dared to imagine. He did not have an answer for what their life would be. He only had the answer that mattered. "Anywhere," he said, his voice soft but absolute, "as long as it is together." It was not a solution. It was a choice to face the ghosts together, a choice to build a life not in the absence of shadows, but in defiance of them. In that moment, standing in the small, dusty room, her escape became their journey. She was not leaving him. He was coming with her, and for the first time the open road did not seem like an escape, but like a destination, a place where, together, they might finally be free. They did not run. His words, a simple and profound declaration of unity, had changed the equation entirely. They chose to stay and face the ghosts together. The trial, when it finally came 6 months later, was an anticlimax. The new territorial marshal, a stern but fair man, had spent those months unraveling the web of corruption Barton McGraw had woven around Dust Valley. The investigation into the former sheriff's crimes inevitably led back to Jedediah Hines. It was discovered that Hines, far from being a simple prospector, had been one of McGraw's informants and enforcers, and that his death had occurred during a double cross over a stolen payroll. The charges against Cole Remington, built on a foundation of lies, collapsed under their own weight. The court of public opinion, however, was a different matter. Cole's confession to his past as a hired gun still hung in the air, but something in Dust Valley had fundamentally shifted. The people had found their voice, and they were no longer content to be swayed by whispers and fear. During the hearings, The blacksmith stood up and spoke of how Remington had faced down McGraw's men for a hungry child. Mrs. O'Malley, her children clean and fed at the back of the room, testified that Cole had anonymously left a winter's supply of flour and bacon on her doorstep after McGraw was jailed, one by one. The people Cole had quietly helped, the ranch hands he treated with fairness, the merchants he dealt with honestly. They spoke for him. They did not deny his past. They simply argued that the man he was now was the man who mattered. In the end, the judge, seeing no outstanding warrants and a town willing to vouch for its own, declared the matter closed. Cole was a free man, his past a scar, not a sentence. The town, reborn from the ashes of McGraw's tyranny, began to heal, and Cole and Eliza were at the heart of it. The Rocking R Ranch, now legally and rightfully Cole's once more, became a symbol of the valley's renewal. Cole hired men who had been cheated by McGraw, offering them fair wages and a chance to rebuild their lives. He used his resources to help restore the businesses that had been bled dry, his quiet leadership a steadying hand in a community learning to trust again. He was no longer the solitary, enigmatic rancher. He was an architect of a new future for the town, a man building a legacy of fairness to replace his history of violence. Eliza, in turn, found her own purpose, not in the clean, anonymous streets of Denver, but in the dusty heart of the town that had once scorned her. She did not take her old job back at the saloon. Instead, with a small loan from Cole, which she insisted on repaying with interest, she rented a small, abandoned shop front next to the general store. She scrubbed it clean, whitewashed the walls, and hung a simple hand-painted sign outside Dust Valley Clinic. It was not a grand hospital, but it was hers. She filled it with jars of herbs, clean linens, and the scent of hope. She became the town's healer, her skills no longer a backroom secret but a public service. She tended to the ranchers, the miners, and their families. She set broken bones, stitched wounds, and delivered babies. She never charged the families who could not afford to pay, like the O'Malleys, accepting a clutch of fresh eggs or a mended bucket as payment. The women who had once whispered about her now brought their sick children to her, their eyes full of a new and profound respect. They no longer saw the saloon girl who had lied. They saw a woman of compassion and skill, a woman who had saved them all in her own way. She had found her calling not by running from her past, but by planting a garden in the very dirt that had once threatened to bury her. Their life together was not one of grand romance, but of a deep and quiet partnership. It was in the way he would stop by her clinic at the end of a long day, his presence a silent comfort as she finished tending to her last patient. It was in the way she would ride out to the Rocking R with a basket of food, her laughter echoing in the ranch house that had been silent for too long. They were rebuilding a town, but they were also building a life, a foundation of shared work, mutual respect, and a love that had been tested in fire and had emerged stronger than steel. One evening in late autumn, as the sun began to set, painting the vast Wyoming sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Cole found her standing on the porch of the ranch house. She was looking out over the valley, a small, peaceful smile on her face. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and curing hay. The dust, stirred by the evening breeze, was no longer a symbol of hardship, but a golden veil that softened the rugged edges of the land, making it beautiful. He came to stand beside her, his arm wrapping gently around her waist, pulling her close. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the light fade. Two people who had found their place in a world that had tried its best to cast them out. "I have something for you," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded square of silk. He shook it out. It was a scarf, the color of a wild rose, a vibrant, defiant splash of color against the muted tones of the prairie. It was soft and new, a luxury she had never allowed herself. He draped it carefully around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin. The silk was warm, a stark contrast to the cooling evening air. She lifted her hand to touch it, her heart swelling with an emotion too deep for words. "It is beautiful, Cole," she whispered. He turned her to face him, his hands resting on her shoulders, his stormy gray eyes soft in the twilight. "I had a choice once," he said, his voice full of a quiet, wondering awe. "A long time ago. The choice was to live alone, with the ghosts of the men I was and the things I had done, to stay a shadow, or to love you, and to step into the light, and be the man you always saw I could be." He smiled, the slow, rare smile that was hers alone. "I chose you, Eliza, forever." The words were a vow, a final, perfect mending of all the broken pieces of their pasts. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, the soft silk of the scarf a tangible symbol of his promise. He was right. Love was a choice, one they had both made in the darkest of moments, a choice to believe in each other when the world gave them every reason not to. Later, as the first stars began to prick the deep velvet of the sky, they saddled their horses. They rode out from the ranch, not as fugitives fleeing into the night, but as partners, equals, riding into their future. They moved at a slow, easy pace across the vast, open prairie, their silhouettes dark against the last, glorious embers of the sunset. They rode side by side, the golden dust of the valley rising around their horses' hooves. No longer a cage, but a shining, luminous cloud that seemed to lift them up. Two souls, finally and truly free, redeemed by a love as wild and enduring as the land itself. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.